The Bride Who Came Too Late. The train lurched to a stop in Willow Creek, Kansas, and Evelyn Hartwell stepped onto a platform empty of everything but wind and broken promises. December 1883 had teeth, sharp enough to cut through wool and hope alike. She clutched the letter that had brought her 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, searching the frozen faces for the husband she'd never met. Instead, a boy emerged from the crowd, 11 years old, maybe 12, with eyes that had already seen too much. "You Miss Hartwell?" he asked, voice flat as the prairie. "I'm Nate Dawson. My pa's dead. Been in the ground since yesterday." Welcome to a story of survival, second chances, and the family we choose when everything else falls apart. If this story moves you, please hit the like button and comment with your city so I can see how far Evelyn's journey travels. Now, let's begin. The words hung in the frozen air between them like something physical, something Evelyn could almost reach out and touch. Dead. The man who had written her 3 careful letters over 4 months, promising her a home and a future far from the Philadelphia boarding house where she'd sewn buttonholes until her fingers bled, gone before she'd ever laid eyes on him. The boy, Nate, stood perfectly still, shoulders squared beneath a coat 2 sizes too large. He didn't look away, didn't fidget. Something in that unnatural stillness made Evelyn's chest tighten. "I'm sorry," she managed, though the words felt inadequate. "I didn't know." Couldn't have known. Nate's gaze shifted to the small trunk at her feet, the only thing she'd brought from her old life. "You got people back east? Someone you can wire?" The question was too practical, too adult coming from a child. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "No. No one." Something flickered across Nate's face. Not quite relief, not quite calculation. "Then I reckon you better come with me." "Come where?" "The homestead, 4 miles northwest." He picked up her trunk before she could protest, smaller frame straining under the weight. "You came all this way. Least we can do is give you a warm meal before you decide what's next." Evelyn glanced back at the train, already taking on coal and water for the journey east. The conductor was watching her with mild interest, probably wondering if she'd be climbing back aboard. She had exactly $17 in her reticule, enough for a ticket partway home, maybe as far as St. Louis, enough to delay the inevitable return to the boarding house, to Mrs. Fletcher's disapproving mouth and the endless parade of gentlemen's shirts that needed mending. She looked at Nate again. Really looked. The coat wasn't just too large, it was a man's coat, sleeves rolled back in thick cuffs. His boots were wrapped with twine where the soles had separated. And beneath the careful blankness of his expression, she saw exhaustion so profound it seemed to radiate from his bones. "All right," she heard herself say, "show me." The wagon was older than Nate, wood-weathered gray and one wheel wobbling on a bent axle. The horse in the traces looked tired, ribs showing even through its winter coat. Nate helped her up with surprising gentleness, then climbed aboard and took the reins. They rode in silence for the first mile. The prairie stretched out in every direction, brown grass bent flat beneath a lid of gray sky. Snow had fallen recently but hadn't stayed. The ground was hard as iron, the wind sharp enough to make Evelyn's eyes water. "How did he die?" she asked finally. "Pneumonia." Nate kept his eyes on the road. "Started as a cold about 2 weeks back. Got worse fast. Doc came out twice, said there wasn't much to be done but keep him comfortable." A pause. "We tried." "We." "You're not alone out here?" "No, ma'am." The wagon hit a rut and Nate guided the horse around it with practiced ease. "There's 7 of us total. Well, 6 now." 6 children. The number settled over Evelyn like a physical weight. "Your mother?" "Died when Lila was born. That was 18 months ago." 18 months of a man trying to raise 6 children alone on a Kansas homestead. 18 months that had driven him to advertise for a wife in an eastern newspaper, reaching out to a woman he'd never met because he was desperate enough to try anything. And now that man was in the ground, and his children were... what? Evelyn's mind raced ahead, trying to understand what she was riding toward. Who was caring for them? Did they have family nearby? What would happen to the homestead? The 2nd mile passed. Then the 3rd. The landscape remained stubbornly the same, flat, brown, empty. Just when Evelyn was beginning to wonder if Nate had any real destination in mind, he pointed ahead. There. She followed his gesture and saw it, a cabin rising from the prairie like something carved from the earth itself. Sod walls, shallow roof, a single window that caught the weak afternoon light. Smoke rose from a chimney pipe, at least, but even from a distance, Evelyn could see the structure listing slightly to one side, as if the weight of the sky was too much to bear. As they drew closer, she noticed other details. The fence posts leaning at drunken angles, the empty chicken coop with its door hanging loose, the vegetable garden buried under dead stalks and frozen earth, and in the doorway, watching them approach, a small figure in a dress too thin for December. The wagon stopped. Nate set the brake and climbed down, then reached up to help Evelyn. Her legs had gone stiff from the cold and the ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. The girl in the doorway stepped forward. She was maybe 9 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that was coming undone and eyes that were older than they should have been. She looked at Evelyn with something that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't welcome either. "This is Rose," Nate said quietly. "My sister." "Rose." Evelyn tried to smile, but the girl's expression didn't change. "I'm Evelyn Hartwell. We know who you are." Rose's voice was flat. "You came to marry Pa." The past tense settled like ash. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I'm so sorry for your loss, for all of your losses." Rose studied her for a long moment, taking in the traveling dress that was too fine for this place, the leather gloves, the small hat pinned carefully in place. Then she turned and disappeared back into the cabin. Nate shifted his weight. It's been hard on her. Hard on all of them." "Of course." Evelyn straightened her shoulders. "May I come in?" "Yes, ma'am." But Nate didn't move toward the door. Instead, he looked at her with those two old eyes. "Before you do, I need to tell you something. Need you to understand what you're walking into." Evelyn waited. "We're in trouble," Nate said simply. "Real trouble. Pa died owing money. To the bank, to the general store, to half the folks in town. We got no cash, no crops put by, and winter's just getting started. The baby's sick. Rose is trying to hold everything together, but she's 9 years old and she shouldn't have to. I do what I can, but I'm just a kid and everybody knows it." He took a breath, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice cracked slightly. "When I saw Pa's letter about you in his desk, I thought I don't know what I thought. That you could help, maybe. That you'd know what to do. But now you're here, and I can see you're just as lost as we are." The honesty of it struck Evelyn like a blow. This child, carrying the weight of 6 lives on shoulders that should have been occupied with schoolwork and play, had spent his last energy and hope bringing a stranger to a home that was falling apart. She could leave. Should leave, probably. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. She'd agreed to marry a man, to help build a life, not to step into the smoking ruins of someone else's catastrophe. But then she thought about Rose standing in that doorway in a too thin dress, about a baby sick inside, about Nate's voice cracking around the edges of his composure. "Let me see them," she said. "Let me see what we're working with." Something shifted in Nate's expression. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of it. He nodded and led her toward the door. The smell hit her first. Smoke and unwashed bodies and something else. Something sour that made her stomach clench. The cabin was a single room, maybe 15 feet square, with a packed earth floor and walls so thin she could see daylight through the gaps in the sod. A cook stove squatted in one corner, its pipe disappearing through the roof. Rough bunks lined 2 walls, covered in blankets that had seen better years. And in every available space, sitting on bunks, huddled near the stove, watching her with wide eyes, were children. Rose stood beside the stove, stirring something in a pot. Evelyn's trained seamstress eye noted the careful patches on her dress, the way the hem had been let down multiple times until there was no fabric left to let. On one of the lower bunks, 2 boys sat close together. The older one, maybe 7, had his arm around a smaller boy who couldn't have been more than 4. Both wore identical expressions of wary confusion. Near the stove, a girl of perhaps 5 played with a cornhusk doll, its face drawn in faded ink. She glanced at Evelyn, then quickly looked away. And in the back corner, In what looked like a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer lay the smallest shape of all. "That's Thomas and Samuel," Nate said, pointing to the boys. "Margaret with the doll. And the baby is Lila." "Hello," Evelyn managed. The older boy, Thomas, nodded slightly. The others just stared. Rose turned from the stove, wooden spoon still in hand. "Supper's almost ready. It's just soup, mostly water and some old potatoes, but it's warm. I'm sure it's lovely." Evelyn set down her reticule and moved closer to the cradle, drawn by something she couldn't name. The baby lay perfectly still, wrapped in blankets that had been white once. Her eyes were closed, tiny face peaceful in sleep. Too peaceful. Evelyn's hand moved without conscious thought, pressing gently against the baby's chest. She felt the faint rise and fall of breath, but it was shallow, irregular. The baby's skin was hot to the touch. How long has she been like this? Rose's spoon stilled. 2 days, maybe 3. She hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. Won't take the bottle, won't hardly wake up. Evelyn looked up sharply. Has a doctor seen her? Doc Patterson came for Pa. Rose's voice was carefully neutral. Said he'd come back for Lila if we could pay. We can't pay. The matter-of-fact delivery of those words, "we can't pay," made something hot and furious rise in Evelyn's chest. She looked at the baby again, at the translucent quality of her skin, the blue tinge around her tiny mouth. This child was dying. They were all watching her die, these children who had already lost both parents because they couldn't pay a doctor to save her. Evelyn stood abruptly. "Where's the nearest store?" Nate blinked. "General store in town, about 4 miles. "The same place your father owed money?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Cassidy runs it. Pa owed him for seed and flour from last spring." Evelyn reached for her reticule and pulled out her purse. $17. It was everything she had, everything between her and absolute destitution. With it, she could buy a train ticket, could run from this disaster and try to rebuild something back east. Or she could try to save a life. "I need you to take me back to town," she said to Nate. "Right now. We need milk, fresh if possible, canned if not, honey if they have it. And I need you to tell me where this doctor lives." Rose was staring at her. "Miss Hartwell, we're not letting this baby die." Evelyn's voice came out harder than she'd intended. "Not today. Not if there's anything we can do about it." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Nate straightened, and something that had been bent in him seemed to lock into place. "Yes, ma'am. I'll get the wagon ready." They made the trip in half the time it had taken to reach the homestead, the old horse finding reserves of energy Evelyn wouldn't have guessed it possessed. The sun was setting by the time they reached town, painting the storefronts in shades of orange and gold that seemed obscene given the circumstances. The general store was still open, lamplight spilling from its windows. Nate tied the horse and followed Evelyn inside. The man behind the counter looked up, his welcoming expression faltering when he saw who had entered. He was middle-aged, balding, with the soft hands of someone who'd never worked land. "Nate Dawson, I heard about your father. My condolences." "Thank you, Mr. Cassidy." Nate's voice was stiff. "This is Miss Hartwell. She needs to make a purchase." Cassidy's eyes moved to Evelyn, taking in her travel-worn clothes and the determined set of her jaw. "Miss Hartwell, the mail-order bride, I presume." The way he said it made it sound like an accusation. Evelyn lifted her chin. "I need fresh milk if you have it. 2 bottles, and honey." "I see." Cassidy made no move to fetch anything. "And how exactly do you plan to pay for these items? The Dawson account is considerably overdrawn as it is." "I'll pay cash." Evelyn set a $5 gold piece on the counter with a sharp click. "Will that be sufficient?" The coin gleamed in the lamplight. Cassidy's expression shifted, calculation replacing judgment. "That'll do fine." He turned to gather the requested items, wrapping them carefully in brown paper. "I also need to know where Dr. Patterson lives," Evelyn said. "The doctor?" Cassidy glanced back at her. "He's on Elm Street, 3 blocks east. White house with green shutters. But I should warn you, I'm not interested in warnings. Thank you for your help." Evelyn gathered the wrapped packages and turned toward the door. "Miss Hartwell." Cassidy's voice stopped her at the threshold. "I don't mean to be indelicate, but you seem like a practical woman. You do understand the situation you're in? Evelyn looked back at him. I understand that there are children who need help. There are children all over this territory who need help. Most folks learn pretty quick that you can't save everyone. He leaned on the counter, voice dropping to something that might have been kindness. John Dawson was a decent man who got in over his head. Those kids, it's a tragedy. It truly is. But you just got here. This isn't your burden to carry. The words echoed what her own practical mind had been telling her since she stepped off the train. She could still walk away, should walk away. But then she thought about Lila's shallow breathing, about Rose stirring watery soup with shoulders that shouldn't have to carry such weight, about Nate's eyes, old before their time. Perhaps not, she said quietly. But it's the burden in front of me, and that seems to matter more than what I planned or what's fair. Good evening, Mr. Cassidy. She walked out before he could respond. Dr. Patterson's house was exactly where Cassidy had said, warm light glowing from multiple windows in a way that spoke of prosperity and comfort. Evelyn climbed the front steps and knocked firmly. The man who answered was older than she'd expected, probably past 60, with silver hair and eyes that had seen their share of death. He looked at her without recognition. Yes? Dr. Patterson? My name is Evelyn Hartwell. I'm here about Lila Dawson. His expression closed like a door slamming. I already told those children. I can pay. Evelyn pulled out another gold piece. I need you to come tonight. Now. Patterson stared at the coin. For a moment she thought he might refuse anyway, but then he sighed heavily. Let me get my bag. You'll need to take me there. My horse is lame. The ride back to the homestead was silent, except for the creaking of the wagon and the endless wind. Patterson sat beside her like a man being led to execution, his black bag clutched on his lap. Nate drove with single-minded focus, coaxing every bit of speed from the exhausted horse. When they arrived, Rose met them at the door. Her eyes went wide at the sight of the doctor. You came. Miss Hartwell here made it worth my while. Patterson stepped inside and went directly to the cradle. He spent several minutes examining Lila in silence, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he checked her pulse, listened to her chest, looked into her mouth and eyes. Finally, he straightened. It's pneumonia. Same as took your father. She's dehydrated, probably hasn't been able to keep anything down. Can you help her? Rose's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe, if we act fast. Patterson turned to Evelyn. I'll need that milk heated, not boiling, just warm. And we'll need to feed her drop by drop through the night. She's too weak to suckle properly. I'll do it, Evelyn said immediately. It's going to be a long night. She might not make it regardless. Then we'd better get started. The hours that followed blurred together in Evelyn's memory. She sat beside the cradle with Lila cradled in the crook of her arm, using a clean cloth to drip warm milk and honey into the baby's mouth. Most of it dribbled back out at first, but slowly, infinitesimally, Lila began to swallow. Dr. Patterson stayed for the first few hours, showing Evelyn how to hold the baby, how to check for signs of improvement or decline. Rose hovered nearby, her fierce protectiveness warring with exhaustion. The other children eventually fell asleep in their bunks, but Nate stayed awake, feeding the stove to keep the cabin warm. Sometime past midnight, Patterson stood to leave. Keep doing what you're doing. If she makes it through the night, she's got a fighting chance. If her fever spikes or her breathing gets worse, there's nothing more I can do. Evelyn looked up from the baby. Thank you for coming. He studied her for a long moment. You're that mail-order bride, the one who was supposed to marry John Dawson. I am. And you're here anyway, spending your own money on children who aren't yours, sitting up all night with a sick baby. He shook his head slowly. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish. Can't quite decide which. Does it matter? A ghost of a smile crossed his lined face. I suppose not. Good luck to you, Miss Hartwell. Something tells me you're going to need it. After he left, the cabin settled into deep silence, broken only by the whisper of breath and the occasional pop from the stove. Evelyn dripped milk into Lila's mouth, watched the tiny throat work, counted each swallow like a prayer. Rose appeared at her elbow, holding a cup of water. You should drink something. Evelyn accepted it gratefully. The girl sat down beside her, and together they watched the baby's chest rise and fall. Why are you doing this? Rose asked finally. You don't know us. You could have gotten right back on that train. Evelyn considered the question. She'd been asking herself the same thing for hours. I had a sister once, she said quietly, younger than me by 5 years, Sarah. She died when she was 7, scarlet fever. Our mother tried everything, but there wasn't enough money for a real doctor, and by the time she found someone willing to come, she swallowed hard. I watched her die. I was 12 years old, and I couldn't do anything to help her. Rose said nothing, but her hand crept across the space between them and rested lightly on Evelyn's arm. I can't bring Sarah back, Evelyn continued, but maybe I can help Lila. Maybe that's enough. They sat together in the lamplit dimness, feeding milk to a dying baby drop by patient drop. And slowly, as the darkest hours of the night gave way to the first gray promise of dawn, Lila's breathing deepened. Her skin grew less frighteningly hot. And when Evelyn dripped milk into her mouth, the baby's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, before closing again in what looked like actual sleep rather than unconsciousness. Rose made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She's better. She's actually better. She's still very sick, Evelyn cautioned, but she couldn't stop the smile spreading across her own face. But yes, I think she's turned a corner. By the time full morning arrived, Lila was breathing easier and had taken nearly half a bottle of milk. Evelyn's arms ached from holding her, and her eyes felt full of sand, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this particular kind of tired, the kind that came from doing something that mattered. Nate emerged from his bunk, took one look at his baby sister's improved color, and sat down hard on the floor. You did it, he said, voice rough. You actually did it. We did it, Evelyn corrected. All of us. The other children woke and crowded around, their faces transformed by something Evelyn hadn't seen in them before. Hope. Thomas actually smiled. Margaret reached out to touch Lila's tiny hand with wondering fingers. Even Samuel, the youngest boy, stopped looking quite so afraid. Rose went to the stove and began making breakfast. More of the watery soup from the night before, but she added some of the milk and honey, transforming it into something that smelled almost good. They ate together, 7 children and one exhausted woman who had arrived yesterday planning to marry a stranger and had instead found herself part of something she didn't yet have words for. After breakfast, Evelyn finally allowed herself to doze, Lila still cradled in her arms. She woke a few hours later to find Rose covering her with a quilt and the cabin full of weak winter sunlight. There's someone here to see you, Rose said quietly. A man from town. He says it's important. Evelyn's stomach clenched. She laid Lila carefully in her cradle and stood, smoothing down her wrinkled dress. What does he want? Didn't say. But Nate's talking to him outside. He looks official. Through the cabin's single window, Evelyn could see a well-dressed man standing beside a black carriage. He was talking to Nate, gesturing at the cabin and the land around it. Even from a distance, there was something predatory in the way he held himself. Evelyn stepped outside and the man turned to face her. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His clothes were expensive, city clothes, out of place on the prairie. Miss Hartwell, I presume. The man removed his hat with practiced courtesy. My name is Harlan Pettigrew. I'm the president of the Willow Creek Bank and Trust. The bank. The place where, according to Nate, John Dawson had owed money. Evelyn's spine straightened. Mr. Pettigrew, what can I do for you? Perhaps we could speak inside. It's a delicate matter. Anything you have to say can be said right here. Evelyn crossed her arms. These children have a right to hear what concerns their home. Pettigrew's smile thinned. Very well. I'll be direct. John Dawson died owing the bank a considerable sum, $240 to be precise. The note comes due in 30 days. $240. The number fell like a stone. Evelyn had spent nearly half her money just getting through one night. That kind of debt was insurmountable. I see, she managed. Given the circumstances, I'm prepared to be reasonable. Pettigrew's tone suggested this was a magnanimous gesture. If the family cannot pay, I'm willing to purchase the land outright. It's not worth much, admittedly, but the creek that runs through it has value. I can offer, shall we say, $50? $50 for 160 acres? Nate's voice cracked with outrage. That's less than a third of what it's worth. That's what it's worth to me. Pettigrew's smile never wavered. Of course, you're free to seek other buyers, but I think you'll find there aren't many people interested in taking on this kind of debt, along with worn-out land and a failing homestead. Evelyn studied the man's face, reading the calculation behind his pleasant expression. This wasn't charity or even business as usual. This was someone seeing an opportunity to profit from desperation. "We'll need time to consider your offer," she said carefully. "Of course. But don't take too long. Winter's only getting started, and I imagine things will get more difficult before they improve." He replaced his hat and climbed back into his carriage. "Good day, Miss Hartwell. Children." They watched him drive away, the black carriage stark against the brown prairie. When it finally disappeared, Nate turned to Evelyn with desperation written across his young face. "We can't sell. This is our home. Pa worked himself to death for this land." "I know." Evelyn's mind was already racing, trying to calculate impossible numbers. $17 minus what she'd already spent left her with maybe $9. The homestead had no livestock except the worn-out horse, no crops, no obvious source of income. Rose appeared in the doorway. "There's more," she said quietly. "We owe Mr. Cassidy $73 at the general store. And there's others, the blacksmith, the mill, folks who helped Pa when times were bad. We tallied it all up last night. Including the bank, it comes to almost $400. $400. It might as well have been 4,000. Evelyn sank down onto the wagon's edge, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "We're going to lose it," Nate said flatly. "Everything Pa worked for. We're going to lose it all." Evelyn looked at him, at all of them standing there in their too thin clothes and too large responsibilities. She thought about the train ticket she didn't have, the life back east she couldn't return to. She thought about Lila sleeping peacefully in her cradle for the first time in days, and Rose's fierce protectiveness, and Nate's eyes that had seen too much. And she thought about the ledger she'd glimpsed yesterday, sitting on the rough table inside. John Dawson's careful handwriting, recording debts and hopes and the daily mathematics of survival. "Let me see that ledger," she said slowly. "All of your father's papers. There has to be something, some record of ownership, some evidence of what this land is actually worth. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we make any decisions." It wasn't hope exactly, but it was better than surrender. And for now, in this frozen corner of Kansas with winter pressing down and debt piling up, better than surrender was all they had. The ledger lay open on the table like an autopsy report, revealing the slow death of John Dawson's dreams in columns of careful numbers. Evelyn turned the pages while the children watched from their bunks, pretending not to listen but hanging on every rustle of paper. The early entries were almost optimistic. Seeds purchased, fence posts delivered, a milk cow acquired in the spring of 1882. But as the pages progressed, the handwriting grew shakier, the entries more desperate. Flour bought on credit, payment delayed. Payment delayed again. And then, in the margins, small notes that broke Evelyn's heart. Margaret needs shoes. Rose's dress past mending. Baby needs medicine. "He tried so hard," Rose whispered from across the room. Evelyn looked up to find the girl watching her with those ancient eyes. "He did. Anyone can see that. One can see." Wasn't enough, though, was it? There was no bitterness in Rose's voice, just exhausted acceptance. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. Evelyn turned another page and froze. There, tucked between entries about seed costs and harvest failures, was a letter. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded many times. The ink faded but still legible. She pulled it free and read the salutation. "Dear John." "What is it?" Nate appeared at her shoulder. "A letter. From someone named Cole." Evelyn skimmed the contents, her pulse quickening. "Your father had a brother?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Finally, Nate spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "Had. Past tense." "What do you mean?" "Uncle Cole left years ago, before most of us were born." Rose joined them at the table. "Ma said he and Pa had a falling out over the homestead. Cole wanted to sell it, take the money and go west. Pa wanted to stay, build something. They fought and Cole left. We haven't heard from him since. Evelyn looked back at the letter. It was dated 8 months earlier, postmarked from a place called Redemption, Colorado. The handwriting was rough, unpracticed, but the words carried weight. John, I know it's been a long time. Too long. I heard about Sarah from a mutual acquaintance passing through. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry for a lot of things. I've been working a claim up in the mountains near Redemption. It's hard country, but honest work. I think about the homestead sometimes, about what we could have built if I hadn't been so stubborn and stupid. If you ever need help, if things get desperate, write to me. I know I don't deserve the chance to make things right, but I'd like to try. Your brother, Cole. Did your father ever write back? Evelyn asked. Nate shook his head. If he did, he never mentioned it, and we never saw Uncle Cole. Pride, Rose said softly. Pa had a lot of pride. He wouldn't have wanted Cole to see how bad things had gotten. Evelyn carefully refolded the letter. Colorado's a long way. Even if we could get word to him, there's no guarantee he'd come, or that he'd be able to help if he did. So we're back where we started. Nate's shoulders slumped. Owing money we can't pay, facing winter with nothing put by. A knock at the door interrupted them. Evelyn rose to answer it and found herself facing a woman perhaps a decade older than herself, bundled in a worn cloak with a basket over her arm. Behind her stood 2 more women, similarly laden. Miss Hartwell, I'm Martha Green. This is Clara Patterson, the doctor's wife, and Susan Yates. We heard you were here. Evelyn stepped back, uncertain. Please, come in. The women entered, their practiced eyes taking in the cabin's poverty with barely a flicker of reaction. Martha set her basket on the table and began unpacking, a loaf of bread, still warm, a jar of preserves, a cloth-wrapped package that smelled of bacon. We wanted to welcome you properly, Martha said, and to offer our condolences about John. He was a good man. We also wanted to thank you, Clara added, her voice soft. My husband told me what you did for little Lila, how you sat up all night with her. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. Anyone would have done the same. That's where you're wrong. Susan's voice was sharp, her eyes shrewd. Most folks wouldn't have. Most folks would have gotten right back on that train and counted themselves lucky to escape. She pulled out a small bag of coffee beans. The fact that you didn't, well, that tells us what kind of woman you are. The kindness of it, the simple human decency after a day of mounting catastrophe, threatened to undo Evelyn completely. She blinked hard against sudden tears. I don't know how to thank you. You already have. Martha's smile was warm. Those children have been alone too long. It does my heart good to see someone looking after them properly. After the women left, promising to return soon, Evelyn and Rose prepared a meal that felt almost luxurious by comparison to the watery soup. Real bread, bacon fried crisp. The children ate with the careful intensity of people who'd gone hungry too often, savoring every bite. That night, with Lila sleeping peacefully and the other children bedded down, Evelyn sat at the table and composed a letter by lamplight. Her hand cramped around the pen. She'd spent so many years sewing that writing felt foreign, but she pushed through. Dear Mr. Dawson, you don't know me, but I knew your brother John, or rather, I was meant to know him. I answered his advertisement for a wife and arrived in Willow Creek to find him already buried. I write to you now because his children are in desperate circumstances. The homestead is drowning in debt, winter is closing in, and I fear they will lose everything your brother worked for unless help arrives soon. I understand there was a falling out between you. I understand you may want nothing to do with this situation, but these children deserve better than to be scattered or sold off piece by piece because the adults in their lives couldn't set aside old wounds. If there is any chance you might help, any possibility of aid, please write back. Time is not on our side. Respectfully, Miss Evelyn Hartwell. She addressed it to Cole Dawson, General Delivery, Redemption, Colorado, and set it aside to mail in the morning. It was a long shot. Less than a long shot. It was desperation dressed up as hope. But it was all she had. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of survival. Evelyn spent her remaining money carefully, buying only what they absolutely needed: flour, salt, a little sugar for Lila's milk. She let out hems and took in seams, transforming adult clothes into children's garments with the skill of years spent sewing. The neighbors continued to help in small ways, a pound of butter here, a basket of turnips there, but Evelyn could see the calculation in their eyes. They were wondering how long she would stay, how long before the reality of the situation sent her running. She wondered the same thing herself, late at night when the wind howled through gaps in the sod walls and the children's breathing was the only sound besides her own doubts. Nate had taken to checking the road every afternoon, watching for the mail wagon even though they both knew it was too soon for a response from Colorado. But on the 8th day after Evelyn had sent her letter, his patience was rewarded, though not in the way either of them had hoped. "Someone's coming," he called from the doorway. "Fancy carriage, 2 horses." Evelyn's stomach dropped. She knew who it was before she saw the black vehicle cresting the rise. Harlan Pettigrew had given them time to consider, and now he'd come to collect his answer. She met him outside, flanked by Nate and Rose. The banker descended from his carriage with the same predatory smile he'd worn before. "Miss Hartwell, children, I trust you've had time to think about my offer?" "We have." Evelyn kept her voice level. "We're not interested in selling." Pettigrew's eyebrows rose. "I see. And how exactly do you plan to satisfy your debts? The banknote comes due in 3 weeks, and I have it on good authority that you've spent the last of your personal funds on supplies." The fact that he knew this, that he'd been keeping track of her movements and purchases, sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. "We'll find a way." "Will you?" He pulled a folded document from his coat. "I took the liberty of reviewing John Dawson's financial records at the bank. The situation is even worse than I initially stated. There are liens, Miss Hartwell, debts secured against the property itself. Even if by some miracle you came up with the money owed to me, there are others waiting in line." "We know about the debts," Nate said, his young voice hard. "Then you know this is inevitable. The question is whether you accept it gracefully or make things difficult for everyone involved." Pettigrew's tone shifted to something that might have passed for sympathy. "I'm not a cruel man. I'm prepared to increase my offer to $75 for the land. That would at least give you children something to start over with." "Start over where?" Rose's question cut through the cold air like a blade. "This is our home. Our parents are buried here." "I understand this is difficult." "Do you?" Evelyn stepped forward, and something in her movement made Pettigrew take an involuntary step back. "Do you understand what it's like to be 11 years old and responsible for 5 younger siblings? To watch your father die of pneumonia because there wasn't money for proper medicine? To face losing the only home you've ever known because men like you see profit in other people's desperation?" Pettigrew's sympathetic mask slipped. "I'm a businessman, Miss Hartwell. I didn't create this situation. John Dawson did when he borrowed more than he could repay. I'm simply dealing with the consequences. By taking advantage of orphan children, by enforcing legally binding contracts." His voice hardened. "You have 3 weeks to come up with $240. If you cannot pay, the property reverts to the bank and you will be evicted. Those are the terms John Dawson agreed to, and those are the terms that will be honored. Good day." He climbed back into his carriage and drove away, leaving them standing in the frozen yard. "What do we do now?" Nate asked quietly. Evelyn had no answer. She'd been in Kansas less than 2 weeks and had already spent nearly everything she owned. The letter to Cole Dawson might never reach him, and even if it did, there was no guarantee he'd respond in time or at all. But that night, as she sat mending one of Thomas's shirts by lamplight, an idea began to form. It was desperate, possibly futile, but it was better than simply waiting for disaster to arrive. "Rose," she called softly. The girl looked up from where she was rocking Lila. "Your father's clothes, where are they?" "In the trunk at the foot of his bunk. Why?" "Because we're going to church on Sunday." Rose blinked. "Church?" "Your father had debts all over town, which means he had relationships all over town. People who knew him, who maybe respected him. If we're going to save this homestead, we need allies. We need people to see you children, to remember that you're part of this community, not just a bad debt to be written off." "You think people will help us?" "I think people might help us more than they'd help Harlan Pettigrew." Evelyn pulled John Dawson's best shirt from the trunk. It was worn but clean, carefully mended at the collar. Nate, this should fit you if we take it in at the shoulders. Rose will let down the hem of your blue dress and add a fresh collar. By Sunday, we're going to look like a family that deserves a chance. She worked through the night and the next day, her needle flying through fabric with the speed of long practice. She transformed Rose's too short dress into something almost respectable. She cut down John's shirt and trousers for Nate, making him look older, more responsible. She fashioned a new dress for Margaret from one of John's old work shirts, the fabric soft from years of washing. For herself, she had only the traveling dress she'd arrived in, but she cleaned and pressed it until it looked less bedraggled. She pinned her hair with extra care and borrowed a bonnet from Martha Green, who'd stopped by with more food and had stayed to help with the mending. "You're making a statement," Martha observed, watching Evelyn work. "I'm making sure people see what they're letting Pettigrew destroy. It might backfire. People don't like being made to feel guilty." "Then they shouldn't have guilty consciences." Evelyn bit off a thread. "Besides, we're out of options. This is the only play we have." Sunday dawned cold and clear. The children dressed in their refurbished clothes with solemn care, as if they understood the importance of what Evelyn was attempting. Even Samuel, who usually squirmed during any grooming attempt, stood still while Rose combed his hair. The church was a simple white building at the edge of town, its steeple visible for miles across the flat prairie. Evelyn had borrowed the wagon and driven them all in, ignoring the stairs as they climbed down and walked up the front steps. Inside, the congregation was already gathered. Conversation died as they entered. Evelyn felt the weight of dozens of eyes, felt the assessment and judgment. She held her head high and led the children to a pew near the front. The service began. Evelyn stood and sat and sang when appropriate, but her attention was on the people around her. She noted who looked at the children with sympathy and who looked away. She cataloged the expensive clothes, the well-fed faces, the casual comfort of people who'd never missed a meal or wondered if they'd have a roof next month. And she saw Harlan Pettigrew sitting in the front pew with his wife, accepting nods and greetings like a lord among peasants. When the service ended and people began filtering outside, Evelyn made her move. She positioned herself and the children directly in the path of the departing congregation, forcing everyone to either acknowledge them or make an obvious effort to avoid them. "Miss Hartwell," the pastor approached, a kind-faced man in his 50s. "We're glad to have you and the Dawson children with us this morning." "Thank you, Pastor," Evelyn pitched her voice to Carrie. "The children wanted to attend their father's church. He spoke of it in his letters, how welcoming the congregation was, how the community looked after one another." It was a calculated statement, a reminder that John Dawson had been one of them. The pastor's expression flickered with understanding and perhaps a touch of discomfort. "John was a good man. We miss him." The pastor looked down at the children. "How are you all managing?" Before Evelyn could answer, Nate spoke up. "We're doing all right, Pastor. Miss Hartwell has been helping us. She saved Lila when the baby was sick. I heard about that." The pastor's smile warmed. "Doc Patterson mentioned your dedication, Miss Hartwell. Sitting up all night with a child who wasn't even your own. Any decent person would have done the same. And yet many wouldn't have." This came from a new voice. Evelyn turned to find a tall man with a weathered face and calloused hands. "Frank Morrison. I own the mill north of town. John Dawson was a good customer and a better neighbor. I'm sorry for your loss, children." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," Rose said quietly. Others began to gather, drawn by curiosity or genuine concern. Evelyn recognized some from the general store, others from Martha Green's descriptions. She watched their faces as they looked at the children, at Nate in his father's altered shirt, standing tall despite his youth, at Rose holding Lila with the careful competence of a mother too young, at the little ones clustered close, wearing hand-me-downs that had been mended more times than anyone could count. "It's admirable what you're doing," a woman said. She was perhaps 30, well-dressed, with kind eyes. "Taking on such a responsibility." "I haven't taken on anything," Evelyn replied. "These children had a home and a family. I'm simply helping them keep what's rightfully theirs." "But surely you understand the difficulties involved." This was a different voice, sharper. Evelyn didn't need to turn to know who it belonged to. Sentiment is all well and good, Miss Hartwell, but it doesn't pay debts. Harlan Pettigrew had joined the circle, his wife on his arm. The crowd's energy shifted, people drawing back slightly as if to avoid being caught in the middle of something unpleasant. "You're right, Mr. Pettigrew." Evelyn turned to face him directly. Sentiment doesn't pay debts. Neither does stealing land from orphans at a fraction of its value. A ripple of shock ran through the gathered congregation. Pettigrew's smile froze. "I beg your pardon? You offered $75 for 160 acres with water rights and an established homestead. I'm no expert on land values, but even I know that's robbery dressed up as charity. Now see here." "No, you see here." Evelyn's voice didn't rise, but it cut through his bluster like a knife. John Dawson died trying to build something for his children. He made mistakes, certainly. He borrowed more than he could easily repay. But he was doing it for them. She gestured at the children. Not for himself. And now you want to take what he built and sell it for profit while these children are turned out with nothing. The bank has rights. And these children have rights too. The right to their father's legacy. The right to be treated with dignity instead of being seen as an inconvenient obstacle to your business dealings. Pettigrew's face had gone red. "You overstep yourself, Miss Hartwell. You're a stranger here, a woman who arrived under false pretenses." "False pretenses?" Evelyn's laugh was harsh. "I came here to marry John Dawson and help him build a life. The fact that he died before I arrived doesn't change my intentions. I'm here now, and I'm not leaving these children to your tender mercies." The crowd was watching with open fascination now. Some faces showed approval, others discomfort. The pastor looked like he wanted to intervene but couldn't quite figure out how. It was Frank Morrison who broke the tension. "Miss Hartwell raises a fair point, Harlan. $75 is a pittance for that property, especially with the creek running through it. The property is mortgaged to the hilt because John had a run of bad luck, not because the land isn't valuable." Morrison crossed his arms. "That creek doesn't run dry even in the worst drought. Any rancher in the county would pay good money for reliable water access." "Which is exactly why the bank wants it," someone muttered. Evelyn couldn't see who, but the comment drew nods of agreement. Pettigrew's jaw tightened. "This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. If Miss Hartwell wishes to contest the bank's claim, she's welcome to seek legal counsel." "With what money?" Rose's question was quiet, but it landed like a thunderclap. "We can't even afford to pay the debts we have. How are we supposed to hire a lawyer?" The girl's blunt honesty seemed to strike harder than Evelyn's anger. Several people looked away, discomfort written on their faces. This was the reality they all knew, but preferred not to acknowledge. That justice was something you could only access if you could afford it. Pettigrew recovered quickly. "I sympathize with your situation, truly I do. But sympathy doesn't change the facts. The bank note comes due in 2 weeks. If you cannot pay, the property will be foreclosed. Those are the terms your father agreed to." He tipped his hat to the crowd. "Good day, everyone." He walked away, his wife hurrying to keep up. The crowd began to disperse, people drifting toward their wagons and horses with carefully neutral expressions. But a few lingered. Martha Green pressed an envelope into Evelyn's hand. "It's not much," she whispered. "Just a few dollars my husband and I can spare, but it's something." Frank Morrison nodded to her. "I'll send word around. There are folks who owe John Dawson for kindnesses past. Maybe it's time those debts were repaid." One by one, people approached with quiet offerings. A promise to send flour. An offer to repair the fence come spring. A widow pressed $2 silver into Rose's palm and walked away before the girl could thank her. By the time they climbed back into the wagon, Evelyn's hands were shaking. The envelope from Martha contained $5. Combined with the widow's contribution and a few other small gifts, they'd collected almost $15. It was nowhere near enough, but it was proof that they weren't completely alone. The ride home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the homestead, Nate suddenly sat up straight. "Someone's there." Evelyn followed his gaze and felt her heart stutter. A man stood beside the cabin, a horse tethered nearby. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheepskin coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. At the sound of their wagon, he turned. Even from a distance, Evelyn could see the resemblance to the children. The same strong jaw. The same way of standing, weight balanced and ready. "Uncle Cole?" Nate's voice cracked on the name. The man moved toward them, and as he got closer, Evelyn could make out more details. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with a face weathered by hard living and eyes that had seen their share of trouble. A scar cut through his left eyebrow. His hands, when he reached up to help her down from the wagon, were calloused and strong. "Nate!" His voice was rough, rusty from disuse. "Rose, I got a letter. From a Miss Evelyn Hartwell." His eyes found hers. "I'm guessing that's you." Evelyn nodded, too stunned to speak. She'd sent the letter barely over a week ago. For him to be here now meant he must have left Colorado almost immediately. Cole looked past her to the other children, his expression unreadable. "Samuel, Thomas, Margaret." He paused, and something cracked in his weathered face. "And little Lila. Last time I saw you, you weren't even born yet." "You came." Rose's voice was small, disbelieving. "After all this time, you actually came." "I came." Cole's hands flexed at his sides, as if he wanted to reach for them, but didn't know if he had the right. "I came to help. If you'll let me." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Evelyn watched the children's faces, saw the war between hope and suspicion playing out in their eyes. They'd been abandoned too many times to trust easily, even when salvation stood right in front of them. It was Nate who broke first, his voice hard with the kind of anger only children who've had to grow up too fast can muster. "You left. When Pa needed you most. When Ma was sick and dying, you just left." Cole didn't flinch from the accusation. "I did." "And now you show up because some stranger wrote you a letter?" Nate's hands clenched into fists. "Where were you when Pa was coughing his lungs out? Where were you when we were eating nothing but watery soup for a week straight?" "I didn't know." Cole's voice remained level, but Evelyn could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Your Pa and we weren't speaking. I didn't know he was sick, didn't know things had gotten this bad." "Would you have come if you'd known?" Rose asked quietly. "Or would you have stayed in Colorado with your pride intact?" The question landed like a blow. Cole looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher. "I don't know. I'd like to think I would have, but the truth is I was so busy being angry about old wounds that I might not have. And I'll have to live with that. But I'm here now, and I'm asking you to let me try to make things right." "We don't need your guilt." Nate's voice cracked. "We need money. We need $240 in 2 weeks, or Mr. Pettigrew takes everything." Cole's expression hardened at the name. "Harlan Pettigrew? The banker?" "You know him?" Evelyn asked. "Knew his type, anyway. Men who see opportunity in other people's suffering." Cole reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. "I don't have $240, but I've got about 80 from selling my claim in Colorado. It's a start." He held out the pouch. No one moved to take it. The children stared at the offering like it might be a trick, something that would disappear the moment they reached for it. Finally, Rose stepped forward. She didn't take the pouch, but she looked Cole directly in the eye. "If we accept this, if we let you help, you don't get to leave again. You don't get to ride off when things get hard or when your conscience feels better. You stay, for good. That's the price." Cole met her gaze without wavering. "I stay. You have my word." "Your word didn't mean much 8 years ago." "No, it didn't." Cole's voice dropped. "But I'm not the same man who left. Colorado has a way of beating the stupidity out of a person, provided they live through it. I've had 8 years to think about what I threw away when I walked out on this family. I won't make that mistake again." Rose studied him for another long moment, then took the pouch. The weight of it seemed to surprise her. She looked up at Cole with something that wasn't quite trust but might become it given time. "All right, you can stay, but you sleep in the barn until you prove yourself." A ghost of a smile crossed Cole's weathered face. "Fair enough?" Evelyn had been watching this exchange with growing respect for Rose's steel spine and Nate's protective fury. These children had been forged in hardship, and they weren't about to let anyone, even blood family, take advantage of their desperation. But now practical matters reasserted themselves. $80 is more than we had an hour ago, she said carefully. Combined with what we collected at church, it brings us to almost 100. We're still well short of what's needed. Then we need a plan to get the rest. Cole looked at the cabin, at the sagging roof and listing walls, and something shifted in his expression. This place has gone to hell. Pa did his best, Nate said defensively. I know he did. And he did it alone when he should have had help. Cole turned in a slow circle, taking in the broken fence, the empty chicken coop, the garden gone to ruin. But we can't save a homestead that's falling apart. First thing tomorrow, we start repairs. We fix what's broken, shore up what's weak. We make this place look like something worth fighting for. That won't pay the debts, Rose pointed out. No, but it might buy us credibility. People are more willing to invest in something that looks viable. Cole's eyes found Evelyn. You're the one who wrote me. What's your read on the situation? Evelyn considered the question. In the 2 weeks since she'd arrived, she'd learned more about human nature than she'd expected. The town is divided. Some people genuinely cared about John and want to help his children. Others see this as a business matter and nothing more. Pettigrew has influence, but he overplayed his hand at church today. People don't like being reminded that they're complicit in something ugly. So we lean on their consciences. Carefully. Push too hard and they'll close ranks against us out of sheer defensiveness. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter against the wind. But there might be another angle. Frank Morrison mentioned that the creek on this property is valuable. What if we offer shares in the water rights as collateral for loans? Cole's eyebrows rose. That's actually not a bad idea. Water rights can be worth more than the land itself out here. If we can structure it right, it becomes an investment rather than charity. Will people go for it? Nate asked. Some might, especially ranchers who've had wells run dry. Cole looked at Evelyn with new appreciation. You've got a head for this. Where'd you learn to think like that? Philadelphia boarding house for working women. We had to be creative about stretching resources. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. I'm good at making something from nothing. It's kept me alive this long. They moved inside, out of the wind that was picking up as afternoon faded toward evening. Cole's presence seemed to fill the small cabin, making it feel even more cramped. He looked around at the packed earth floor, the inadequate bunks, the stove that barely held heat, and Evelyn saw him swallow hard. I should have been here, he said quietly. All these years, I should have been here. You weren't. Rose's voice was matter-of-fact as she settled Lila in her cradle. So now you have to live with it and do better going forward. That's how it works. The bluntness of it seemed to hit Cole harder than anger would have. He nodded slowly and turned to Evelyn. That letter you wrote. You could have just told me about the debts, but you didn't. You told me about them. He gestured at the children. You said they deserved better. Why did you do that? Evelyn thought about the question. Because they do deserve better. And because I thought you might need to hear that it wasn't about obligation or guilt, it was about whether you were the kind of man who'd let blood families suffer when you had the power to help. And what if I wasn't? What if I'd ignored the letter or sent money but didn't come myself? Then we'd have found another way. We still will, if it comes to that. Evelyn began unpacking the food they'd brought from town. But I believed you'd come. Your brother kept your letter, folded it and unfolded it enough times to wear the creases thin. That told me something about both of you, that neither one could quite let go despite all the anger. Cole looked away, jaw working. John was a better man than me. Always was. Maybe. But you're the one who's here now, and that has to count for something. They ate a simple supper of bread and the last of the bacon Martha Green had brought. Cole wolfed down his portion like a man who'd gone hungry before, then caught himself and slowed down, watching the children to make sure they had enough. It was a small thing, but Evelyn noticed. So did Rose, whose suspicious gaze softened just slightly. After supper, Cole went to tend to his horse while Evelyn helped Rose clean up. The girl worked in silence for several minutes before speaking. Do you think he'll really stay? Evelyn dried a tin plate carefully. I think he means to. Whether he can follow through, that remains to be seen. What happens if he doesn't? If he leaves again? Then we do what we've been doing. We survive. Rose's hands stilled in the wash water. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this, pretending to be strong enough, old enough. Every morning I wake up and I'm scared. Every night I wonder if tomorrow's the day it all falls apart. Evelyn set down the plate and turned to the girl. Rose, look at me. When those ancient eyes met hers, she continued, You are strong enough. You've kept your siblings alive through circumstances that would have broken most adults, but you shouldn't have to carry this alone. That's why I'm here. That's why your uncle came. Not to take over, but to share the weight so you can be 9 years old again, at least some of the time. I don't remember how to be 9. Rose's voice cracked. I don't remember what that feels like. Then we'll figure it out together. Evelyn pulled the girl into a hug, and Rose collapsed against her like a marionette with cut strings, finally allowing herself to be the child she was. They stood like that for a long moment while the wind howled outside and the little ones slept, safe and warm, because this girl had sacrificed her childhood to keep them that way. When Rose finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear. I'm glad you came, Miss Hartwell. Even if everything else falls apart, I'm glad you came. So am I. Cole returned from the barn, stamping his feet against the cold. Storm's coming in. Could be a bad one. How bad? Nate asked. Bad enough that we should secure anything loose and make sure we've got enough firewood. Cole looked around the cabin. This place going to hold if the wind gets serious? It's held before, Nate said defensively. That's not what I asked. The boy's shoulders slumped. I don't know. The roof leaks. There's gaps in the walls. If the wind comes from the north, it tears right through. Cole nodded grimly. Then tomorrow we start repairs. Tonight, we just try to stay warm. The storm hit around midnight. Evelyn woke to the sound of wind screaming around the cabin like something alive and furious. The walls shook. The stovepipe rattled. She could feel cold air pouring through cracks she hadn't known existed. Across the room, she heard movement. Cole was up, checking the stove, adding fuel. In the dim firelight, she saw him move to the door and brace it with his shoulder when it started to rattle in its frame. It's going to blow through, he said quietly. Get the children into the center of the room, away from the walls. Evelyn didn't argue. She woke Rose first, and together they roused the others. The children huddled together on blankets in the middle of the floor while the storm raged. Little Samuel cried, and Margaret clung to Rose. Evelyn held Lila close, protecting the baby's head with her hand. Is the cabin going to fall down? Thomas asked, voice small with fear. No, Cole said firmly. He'd moved from the door to the window, which was flexing inward with each gust. Your pa built this place to last. It's weathered worse than this. How do you know? Nate challenged. Because I helped him build it, back before... Cole trailed off. Back when we were still brothers. The admission hung in the air between them. Nate stared at his uncle, and Evelyn could see the internal struggle. The desire to trust warring with years of feeling abandoned. A particularly violent gust hit the cabin, and this time they heard an ominous crack. Part of the roof was giving way. Everyone stay put. Cole grabbed his coat. I'm going to try to secure it from outside. You can't go out in this, Evelyn protested. You'll be killed. And if the roof goes, we'll all be in trouble anyway. Cole was already moving toward the door. Keep them calm. I'll be back. He disappeared into the howling darkness. Evelyn's heart hammered as she listened to the storm, trying to separate the sounds of wind and rain from anything that might indicate disaster. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Rose had her arms around Samuel and Margaret, singing softly to them. Nate sat rigid, fists clenched, staring at the door like he could will his uncle back through sheer force of determination. Thomas had buried his face against Evelyn's shoulder. Then, impossibly, they heard footsteps on the roof. The sounds of hammering, of wood being shifted and secured. Cole was up there in the teeth of the storm, doing what needed to be done. He's crazy, Nate muttered, but there was something like admiration in his voice. The hammering continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. Then the door burst open, and Cole stumbled in, soaked to the bone and bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Got it secured, he gasped. Won't be pretty, but it'll hold till morning. Rose was already moving, grabbing clean rags and the last of their drinking water. Sit down before you fall down. Cole obeyed, dropping onto one of the bunks. Rose dabbed at the cut on his head with surprising gentleness. This is going to scar. Won't be my first. Cole caught her wrist gently. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If you've given yourself pneumonia from being out in that storm, I'm going to be very angry with you. Despite everything, Cole smiled. Noted. The storm blew itself out near dawn. When morning finally came, pale and cold, they emerged from the cabin to survey the damage. Part of the roof was indeed torn loose, patched now with boards Cole had scavenged from the barn and nailed down in the dark. The fence had blown over in 3 places. The chicken coop, already in poor condition, had collapsed entirely, but the cabin had held. They'd made it through. Cole stood in the yard looking at the devastation with the calculating eye of someone assessing a job of work. All right, he said finally. Here's what we're going to do. Nate, you're with me. We start with the roof. Do it properly this time. Rose, you and Miss Hartwell take inventory of what we have and what we need. Make a list. Be specific. And us? Thomas asked. Cole looked at the younger boy thoughtfully. You and Samuel collect every nail, every scrap of usable wood from the chicken coop. Margaret, you help your sisters inside. We all work. They fell to it with the kind of desperate energy born of knowing time was running out. Cole and Nate climbed onto the roof with tools salvaged from the barn. Evelyn and Rose went through the cabin and the outbuildings, making careful notes of every resource and every lack. The list, when finished, was daunting. They needed lumber, nails, tar paper for the roof, glass for the window, hinges for the door. They needed a plow for spring planting, seed to put in the ground, chickens to replace the ones that had died or wandered off. They needed winter provisions, flour, salt, sugar, dried beans, coffee. The numbers added up to more than the money they had, more than the money they could reasonably expect to raise. It's impossible, Rose said flatly, looking at the ledger. Maybe, Evelyn studied the figures. Or maybe we prioritize. We fix what will kill us first. Shelter, heat, food. The rest can wait. And Pettigrew? We deal with Pettigrew when the time comes. One problem at a time. Over the next 3 days, the homestead transformed. Cole worked from dawn to dusk, and Nate shadowed him like a persistent ghost, learning as he went. Together they repaired the roof properly, replacing rotted boards and sealing gaps with pitch. They rebuilt the chicken coop using salvaged wood and borrowed nails. They fixed the fence, at least the sections closest to the cabin. Evelyn watched Cole work and saw that he knew what he was doing. These weren't the hands of a man who'd spent his life avoiding labor. He moved with the competence of someone who'd built things before, who understood how structures went together and what made them strong. Where did you learn all this? She asked him one evening as he came in for supper, hands black with pitch. Mining camp in Colorado. You learn fast or you die. Built my own cabin, helped build half the town. He washed his hands in the basin. Turns out I'm better at building things than I ever was at walking away from them. Then why did you? Cole was quiet for a long moment. Pride, anger, youth. Take your pick. John wanted to stay here, work this land, build something permanent. I wanted adventure, wanted to see what was over the next hill. We fought about it, said things that couldn't be taken back. And then one day I just left. Told myself I'd come back when I'd made my fortune. Prove him wrong about everything. Did you? Make your fortune? No. Mostly I made mistakes and got lucky enough to survive them. He looked at her directly. But I learned some things. Learned that running away doesn't solve anything. Learned that the things you leave behind have a way of haunting you. And I learned that family, real family, is worth more than gold in the ground or pride in your pocket. What made you finally understand that? Time. And watching good men die alone in mining accidents because they had no one to care if they lived or fell. Cole's voice roughened. I didn't want to be one of them. Didn't want to die and have it mean nothing to anyone. Before Evelyn could respond, Nate called from the doorway. Uncle Cole, that board's starting to split. You better come look. Cole went, and Evelyn was left with his words echoing in her mind. This man had come back from Colorado not just because of her letter, but because he'd finally learned what his brother had known all along, that some things were worth staying for. On the 4th day, they had visitors. Frank Morrison arrived with his wagon, and in the back were 3 other men Evelyn recognized from church. They brought lumber, nails, a bag of seed corn, and something more valuable, their labor. Heard you were making improvements, Morrison said, climbing down. Figured you could use some help. Cole looked at the offering with undisguised suspicion. What's the catch? No catch. John Dawson helped me fix my mill wheel 2 summers ago when it broke. Never asked for payment, said we'd square up when I had something he needed. Morrison gestured at the cabin. Looks like that time has come. One of the other men stepped forward. Name's Bill Tucker. John lent me his horse when mine broke a leg during harvest. I'm here to pay that debt. The third man nodded. Robert Hayes. Your brother helped my wife when she took sick last winter, chopped wood for us every day for 2 weeks. I never got to thank him proper. Cole's throat worked. He never mentioned any of this. He wouldn't have. That was John's way. Morrison set a hand on Cole's shoulder. We can't save the homestead for you, but we can help you fight for it. That's what neighbors do. They worked together through that day and the next, and the transformation was remarkable. With 6 sets of hands instead of 2, they accomplished in days what would have taken weeks. The roof was completely repaired. The fence stood straight and strong. They even managed to dig a new well closer to the cabin, striking water at 15 feet. In the evenings, the men shared stories about John Dawson, about the time he'd helped pull a neighbor's wagon from the mud during spring thaw, about how he'd sat up all night with a sick child when the parents were desperate and exhausted, about his quiet kindness, his willingness to help without expectation of return. The children listened with shining eyes, hungry for these pieces of their father. And Evelyn watched Cole's face as he heard about the man his brother had become, the man he'd never given himself the chance to know. On the 6th day, with the major repairs complete, Frank Morrison pulled Evelyn aside. I've been thinking about what you said at church, about the water rights. Yes? I talked to some of the other ranchers. We're interested. That creek of yours runs year-round and water's going to be worth its weight in gold come summer drought. He pulled out a folded paper. We're proposing a cooperative. You grant us access to the creek for our livestock, controlled access on a schedule, and in exchange we pay an annual fee, enough to cover your banknote with some left over. Evelyn's heart began to pound. How much are we talking about? $200 a year, divided among 5 ranchers. First payment up front. It was almost too good to be true. And the catch? Morrison smiled. You're learning. The catch is that you have to maintain the property. Can't let it fall into disrepair. And if you sell, the water rights agreement transfers to the new owner. Pettigrew finds out about this arrangement. He'll know the land is worth more than he's offering. He'll also know we can pay the debt. Exactly. So the question is, are you ready for that fight? Because once you show you can pay, he might get creative about finding other ways to take this land. Evelyn looked at the cabin, at Cole and Nate working together to shore up the barn wall, at Rose hanging laundry with Margaret's help. She thought about what this place had cost John Dawson, about what it meant to these children. We're ready, she said. Draw up the papers. The papers were drawn up within 3 days, signed in Frank Morrison's front parlor with his wife as witness. 5 ranchers committed to the water cooperative, each paying $40 annually for access rights to the creek that ran through Dawson land. The first year's payment came in cash, $200 in bills and coin that felt impossibly heavy in Evelyn's hands. This is really happening, Rose whispered as they walked back to the wagon. She held the leather document case like it contained something sacred. We can actually pay the bank. We can pay the banknote, Evelyn corrected gently. There are still other debts, but it's a start. Cole helped them into the wagon, his weathered face unreadable. He'd been quiet during the signing, standing in the back of Morrison's parlor like a man who didn't quite believe he had the right to be there. Now he took the reins and guided the horse toward town with careful precision. Your brother built something good here, he said finally. Something worth more than just land and water. He built trust. These people wouldn't have signed those papers for me. They signed them for the children, Evelyn said. Maybe, but you're the one who made them see the possibility. You're the one who turned grief into action. Cole glanced at her. John chose well when he wrote to you, even if he didn't live to see it. The words settled over Evelyn like a weight. She'd spent the last 3 weeks surviving moment to moment, fighting crisis after crisis, and hadn't allowed herself to think about the larger picture. But Cole was right. She'd somehow become the linchpin holding this whole fragile enterprise together, and the responsibility of it was staggering. They reached town just as the bank was preparing to close for the day. Harlan Pettigrew was standing on the front steps, locking the door when their wagon pulled up. His expression when he saw them was almost comical, surprise quickly masked by calculation. "Miss Hartwell, Mr. Dawson." He took in Cole's presence with a flicker of concern. "I wasn't expecting you." "The note doesn't come due for another 8 days," Evelyn said, climbing down from the wagon. "But we thought we'd settle it early." Pettigrew's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I'm afraid the bank is closed for the day. You'll have to come back tomorrow." "Then open it." Cole's voice was flat. "Unless you'd rather we tell everyone in town that you refuse to accept payment on a debt." The two men stared at each other, and Evelyn could feel the tension crackling between them. Pettigrew was used to being the most powerful man in any room, used to people deferring to his authority. Cole clearly didn't give a damn about any of that. "Very well." Pettigrew unlocked the door with more force than necessary. "Though I must say, this is highly irregular." Inside, the bank was all dark wood and brass fixtures, smelling of ink and old money. Pettigrew went behind the counter and pulled out a heavy ledger, making a show of finding the correct entry. "The Dawson account. Principal of $240 plus accumulated interest brings the total to $253.40. "Interest?" Nate's voice cracked with outrage. "You never said anything about interest." "It's standard practice, young man. Outlined clearly in the loan documents your father signed." Pettigrew's tone was patronizing. "Surely you didn't think the bank would lend money out of the goodness of its heart." Cole leaned across the counter, and Pettigrew actually took a step back. "How much of that interest accrued after John died, when you knew damn well these children couldn't pay? The terms of the loan don't change based on the borrower's circumstances." "No, but a decent man might show some compassion to orphans." Cole's voice was dangerously quiet. "Then again, I'm starting to think decency isn't something you're familiar with." Evelyn put a hand on Cole's arm, feeling the coiled tension in his muscles. "We have the money. Let's just pay it and be done." She counted out $253.40, every bill and coin accounted for. Pettigrew accepted it with barely concealed frustration, marking the ledger with sharp, angry strokes. When he was finished, he pulled out a receipt and thrust it at Evelyn. "There. The note is satisfied. Though I must say, I'm curious as to how you came up with such a sum on such short notice." "That's none of your concern," Evelyn said coolly. "Actually, as the banker for this community, it very much is my concern. If you've entered into any agreements that might affect property values or water rights." "We've entered into an agreement with our neighbors," Cole cut in. "Legal, binding, and none of your damn business. Now, unless you have further official business with us, we'll be on our way." They walked out of the bank with their heads high, leaving Pettigrew standing behind his counter with rage and frustration written across his face. The receipt felt like victory in Evelyn's pocket, tangible proof that they'd won this round. But as they climbed back into the wagon, Cole's expression was troubled. He's not going to let this go. Men like Pettigrew don't take losing well. What can he do? The debt is paid. He can make life difficult in other ways, deny credit at stores that do business with his bank, spread rumors, put pressure on the ranchers to back out of the water cooperative. Cole took up the reins. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next." What came next arrived 2 days later in the form of a stranger riding a fine black horse. He dismounted in the yard while Evelyn was hanging laundry and approached with the careful courtesy of someone delivering bad news. "Miss Hartwell, my name is Gerald Thorne. I'm an attorney from Topeka." He pulled a folded document from his saddlebag. "I've been retained to inform you of a legal matter concerning this property." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "What kind of legal matter?" "There's a lien on this land, filed by the county 3 years ago for unpaid taxes. The amount owed is $67, plus accumulated penalties and interest, bringing the total to $92. He handed her the document. "If not satisfied within 30 days, the county has the authority to seize and auction the property." The words seemed to come from very far away. Evelyn stared at the paper in her hands, at the official stamps and legal language that added up to disaster. I don't understand. We paid the bank. We settled that debt. The bank debt and the tax lien are separate matters. The lien was filed before Mr. Dawson took out his loan with the bank. Thorne's expression was sympathetic. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. Cole appeared from the barn, took one look at Evelyn's face, and crossed the yard in long strides. What's happened? She handed him the document without speaking. He read it, his jaw tightening with each line. When he looked up at Thorne, his eyes were hard. Who hired you to deliver this? The county doesn't usually send attorneys for collection matters. Thorne had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'm not at liberty to say. You don't have to. We both know who benefits from us failing. Cole handed the paper back to Evelyn. Pettigrew found another way to take the land. The lien is legitimate, Thorne said quickly. I verified it myself. The taxes were unpaid, the lien properly filed. This isn't a fabrication. But the timing is awfully convenient, isn't it? This lien has been sitting dormant for 3 years, and suddenly it's being enforced right after we paid off the bank? Cole's voice was sharp with anger. Let me guess. If we can't pay, the property goes to auction, and Pettigrew just happens to be the highest bidder? Thorne said nothing, which was answer enough. After the attorney left, Evelyn and Cole sat at the table while the children listened from their bunks with wide, frightened eyes. The receipt from the bank sat next to the lien notice, physical proof that their victory had been temporary at best. We have $47 left, Evelyn said, tallying numbers in her head. Between what remained from the water cooperative payment and what people gave us at church, that leaves us $45 short. Plus we still owe Cassidy at the general store, the blacksmith, and half a dozen others. Rose's voice was dull. Even if we pay this tax lien, there's always going to be something else. They're never going to let us keep this place. Don't say that. Nate's hands were clenched into fists. Don't give up. I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic. We're children. Miss Hartwell is a seamstress. Uncle Cole is a miner. None of us know how to run a homestead, and even if we did, we're drowning in debt. Maybe it's time to face facts. The fact is that your father died for this land, Cole said, his voice rough. The fact is that 5 families are buried in the cemetery on that hill. The fact is that Pettigrew wants us to give up so he can steal what's rightfully yours. Are those the facts you want to face? Rose's eyes filled with tears. I just don't want to lose anymore. I can't keep fighting when I know how it's going to end. Evelyn reached across the table and took the girl's hand. Then let us fight for you. You've carried this weight long enough, Rose. Let the adults handle it for a while. How? We don't have enough money. We can't pay the lien and the other debts. Maybe not all at once, but we can buy time. Evelyn looked at Cole. The water cooperative payments will continue. That's reliable income. If we can negotiate extensions on the other debts, show people we have a viable plan. Pettigrew will block us, Cole interrupted. Any merchant who does business with his bank won't extend us credit, and most of them do. Then we find the ones who don't. Evelyn stood, her mind already racing ahead. We go to every person your brother helped. We remind them of what he did. We ask them to give his children the same chance he gave them. That's asking a lot. Yes, it is, but it's all we have. Evelyn met his eyes. Unless you have a better idea. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood as well. All right, we fight, but we do it smart. We split up, cover more ground. You take the people in town, you're better at talking to them anyway. I'll hit the outlying farms and ranches. Nate, you come with me. Rose, you stay here with the little ones and keep everything running. They spent the rest of the day making a list of everyone John Dawson had helped over the years, piecing together a map of kindness that stretched across the county. The names came from the children's memories, from the ledger's notes, from conversations with Martha Green and the other women who'd brought food. By evening, they had 17 names, 17 possibilities, 17 chances to find the money they needed. Evelyn started her campaign the next morning, dressed in her best traveling suit with her hair pinned up in a way that suggested competence and respectability. She went first to the general store, where Mr. Cassidy looked up from his account books with obvious wariness. Miss Hartwell, I heard about the tax lien. I'm sorry. Are you? Evelyn kept her voice neutral. Sorry enough to extend our credit for essential supplies? Cassidy's expression shifted to discomfort. You know I can't do that. Your account is already overdrawn, and with Pettigrew making noise about anyone who does business with you, so he's already gotten to you. He's my banker, Miss Hartwell, and he holds notes on half the inventory in this store. I can't afford to antagonize him, not with winter coming and shipments getting more expensive. Cassidy's voice held genuine regret. I wish I could help, truly, but I have my own family to think about. Evelyn left without arguing. There was no point. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Pettigrew had wielded it expertly. She had better luck at the milliner's shop, where the proprietor remembered that John Dawson had repaired her storefront after a summer storm had damaged it. She offered $10 toward the tax lien and a promise to spread the word among her customers. The blacksmith, a huge man named Anders Peterson, surprised her by pulling out $20 without being asked. John Dawson loaned me money to buy my first anvil, never asked for it back. This is me paying that debt. Tell the children I'm sorry about their pa. By afternoon, Evelyn had collected $32 in pledges and $12 in cash. It wasn't enough, but it was progress. She was heading toward the church to speak with the pastor when she saw a crowd gathered outside the bank. Her heart sank when she recognized Harlan Pettigrew standing on the steps, holding court like a king addressing his subjects. His voice carried across the street, pitched for maximum audibility. I understand there's been some confusion about the Dawson situation. I want to set the record straight. The tax lien on that property is legitimate and has been outstanding for years. The county has a right to collect what's owed, and if the current occupants cannot pay, the property will be sold at auction as the law requires. What about the water cooperative, Bob? Someone in the crowd called out. I heard the ranchers paid good money for access to that creek. Any agreements made regarding property under lien are subject to review by the courts. If the land is sold at auction, those agreements may not transfer to the new owner. Pettigrew's smile was thin. I wouldn't want anyone to invest money in an arrangement that might not be honored. Evelyn felt rage building in her chest. He was doing exactly what Cole had predicted, undermining the water cooperative, making the ranchers question whether their investment was secure. If they pulled out, the homestead would lose its only reliable source of income. She pushed through the crowd, and heads turned as people recognized her. Pettigrew's smile widened when he saw her approaching. Miss Hartwell, how fortuitous. Perhaps you'd like to address these concerns yourself. Evelyn climbed the steps until she stood level with him, acutely aware of every eye on her. She could feel her pulse pounding, but forced her voice to remain steady. Mr. Pettigrew is right that the tax lien is legitimate. What he's not telling you is that this lien has been dormant for 3 years. 3 years during which John Dawson struggled to keep his family fed and his children healthy. 3 years during which the county made no effort to collect what was owed. The law doesn't have a deadline for collection, Pettigrew interjected smoothly. No, but common decency suggests that you don't wait until a man is dead and his children are orphaned before swooping in to take his land. Evelyn turned to face the crowd directly. John Dawson spent his life helping this community. How many of you are wearing clothes he helped mend? How many of you have eaten food from a garden he helped plant? How many of you have children who played with his children, who shared their toys and their laughter? She could see the discomfort on people's faces, the recognition of truth they'd rather not acknowledge. He gave to this community without asking for anything in return. And now his children need help. And where are you? You're standing here listening to a banker tell you why it's not your problem, why it's better to let the land be sold to the highest bidder, why investing in those children's future is somehow risky when the real risk is becoming the kind of people who let orphans lose their home because helping them might be inconvenient. This is emotional manipulation, Pettigrew said sharply. Business cannot be conducted on sentiment. This isn't business, Evelyn snapped. This is community. Or at least it's supposed to be. John Dawson believed that. He lived it every day of his life. And if you can't see that, if you can't understand why his children deserve the same loyalty he showed all of you, then maybe you're not the community I thought you were. The silence that followed was broken by a voice from the back of the crowd. I'll pledge $5 toward the tax lien. It was Clara Patterson, the doctor's wife, her face set with determination. And I'll match that, called Robert Hayes, the man whose wife John had helped. "Count me in for 10, shouted Bill Tucker. One by one, people stepped forward with pledges. Not everyone. Some melted away into side streets, unwilling to be associated with either side of the conflict. But enough remained, enough to matter. Pettigrew's face had gone red. "You're making a mistake, all of you. When this property goes to auction, if it goes to auction," Morrison's voice cut through the chatter. The rancher pushed through the crowd, his weathered face set in hard lines. "That's not a foregone conclusion, Harlan. Not if the community has anything to say about it. The law says the tax must be paid. It doesn't say who has to pay it or how." Morrison turned to address the crowd. "I'm proposing we take up a collection, right here, right now. Everyone who benefited from John Dawson's help over the years, everyone who believes his children deserve better than being thrown off their land, dig into your pockets and let's see what we can do." Hats were passed. Money clinked as it dropped in, pennies and nickels from people who had little to spare, dollars from those who could afford more. Evelyn watched with a lump in her throat as the community John Dawson had served stepped up to serve his children in return. By the time the hats had made their rounds, they'd collected $63. Combined with what Evelyn had gathered earlier, it was enough to pay the tax lien with a few dollars to spare. Pettigrew looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. "This changes nothing. There are still other debts, which we'll deal with as they come." Morrison handed the hat full of money to Evelyn. "One crisis at a time, Harlan. That's how decent people handle things." The crowd began to disperse, people drifting back to their businesses and homes. Evelyn stood on the bank steps, clutching the hat full of hope and trying not to cry. She'd come to Kansas expecting to marry a stranger and build a simple life. Instead, she'd found herself in the middle of a war for a family's survival, armed with nothing but determination and the kindness of people who remembered what it meant to look after your own. Martha Green appeared at her elbow. "That was quite a speech." "I meant every word." "I know you did. That's what made it effective." Martha squeezed her arm. "But you've also made an enemy. Pettigrew doesn't forget people who embarrass him in public." "I'm not afraid of him." "Maybe you should be. Men like that have ways of making life difficult when they can't win outright." Martha's voice dropped. "Watch your back, Evelyn, and watch those children. Pettigrew's not done yet." Cole and Nate returned that evening with another $23 in pledges from the outlying farms. When Evelyn told them about the confrontation with Pettigrew and the money collected in town, Cole's expression cycled through shock, pride, and deep concern. "You made him look like a fool in front of the whole town," he said finally. "That's dangerous." "I made him look like what he is, a man who profits from other people's misery." Evelyn set the money on the table. "And we have enough to pay the tax lien. That's what matters. For now. But Martha's right. He's not going to let this go." Cole paced the small cabin like a caged animal. "We need to think ahead. What's his next move?" "Does it matter?" Rose asked from where she sat holding Lila. "We're always going to be reacting to whatever he does. We can't win that way." "So what do you suggest?" Cole stopped pacing to look at his niece. "I don't know. I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of waiting for the next disaster." Rose's voice cracked. "I want this to be over." Evelyn crossed to the girl and knelt beside her chair. "It will be. Maybe not tomorrow or next week, but it will be. Because we're not giving up and we're not going to let him win. Do you understand me? We're going to save this place." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen what this community is capable of when they remember who they are. And because your father built something here that's worth fighting for, not just land and water, but a legacy of kindness that's still bearing fruit even after he's gone." Evelyn took Rose's hand. "That's stronger than any banker's greed. That's what's going to save us." Rose looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Some of the tension left her young shoulders, and she leaned into Evelyn's embrace with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul. That night, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, Evelyn sat at the table going over the numbers one more time. They had enough to pay the tax lien. They had pledges of future payment on the other debts. They had the water cooperative providing steady income. On paper, they were solvent, barely, but solvent nonetheless. But she knew Cole and Martha were right. Pettigrew would find another way to attack. He had resources they couldn't match and influence they couldn't counter. The question wasn't if he'd strike again, but when and how. Cole emerged from the barn where he'd been sleeping, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders against the cold. He sat down across from her without speaking, and they shared a companionable silence. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything you've done for these kids, for John's memory." "I didn't do it for John. I did it for them." "I know. That's what makes it matter." Cole looked at the sleeping children. "You know what the hardest part of all this is? Knowing that if I'd stayed, if I'd set aside my pride and been here when John needed me, none of this would be happening. Those kids wouldn't have lost both parents. The debts wouldn't have piled up. Everything would be different." "Maybe. Or maybe you both would have killed each other and things would be worse." Evelyn softened her tone. "You can't change the past, Cole. All you can do is show up for the present and try to build a better future. That's all any of us can do." "Is that what you're doing here? Building a better future?" Evelyn thought about the question. "I came here planning to marry a stranger because I was desperate for a different life. I got a different life, just not the one I expected. These children need me. This fight needs me. And maybe I needed them too, needed something to fight for that was bigger than just my own survival." Cole studied her face in the lamplight. "You're a remarkable woman, Evelyn Hartwell." "I'm a stubborn woman who doesn't know when to quit." "Same thing in my experience." Cole stood, preparing to return to the barn. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we pay the lien and figure out our next move." "Cole?" He paused at the door. "I'm glad you came. I'm glad you stayed. Whatever happens next, I'm glad we're not facing it alone." His silhouette nodded against the darkness. "So am I." They paid the tax lien the next morning at the county office, Gerald Thorne witnessing the transaction with an expression that might have been respect. He counted the money twice, marked the lien satisfied in his records, and handed Evelyn a receipt that felt like a shield against the world. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said quietly as they prepared to leave. "Pettigrew doesn't take defeat well. He'll find another angle." "Let him try." Evelyn folded the receipt carefully. "We're not going anywhere." But Thorne's warning proved prescient sooner than any of them expected. 3 days later, as Cole and Nate were working on reinforcing the barn, a rider came hard up the road. It was Robert Hayes, his face flushed with exertion. "Pettigrew's called in the water cooperative contracts," he said, dismounting in a rush. "Says they were signed under duress and aren't legally binding. He's got that attorney from Topeka backing him up, claiming some technicality about property rights under lien." Cole's face went dark. "Can he do that?" "He's claiming he can, and he's putting pressure on Morrison and the others, threatening to call in loans, deny credit. Half the ranchers are ready to fold just to avoid trouble." Hayes looked genuinely distressed. "I'm sorry. We want to stand with you, but most of us can't afford to fight the bank." After Hayes left, Evelyn sat at the table with the water cooperative documents spread before her, reading every line with a seamstress's attention to detail. Rose stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. "There," the girl said suddenly, pointing. "That clause. It says the agreement is binding regardless of liens or encumbrances on the property. Mr. Morrison had it put in specifically." Evelyn read the passage, her pulse quickening. Rose was right. Frank Morrison had anticipated this exact scenario and built protection into the contract. This means Pettigrew can't void the agreements no matter what he claims. "But will the ranchers stand firm?" Cole asked. Hayes made it sound like they're ready to cave. "Then we need to remind them what's at stake." Evelyn stood, decision crystallizing. "Not just for us, but for all of them. If Pettigrew can bully people into breaking legal contracts, no one in this valley is safe from him." She drafted a letter that night, carefully worded to appeal to both self-interest and principle. She reminded the ranchers that the water cooperative protected all of them from future drought, that reliable water access was worth fighting for, that the contract they'd signed was legally sound despite Pettigrew's threats. She reminded them that today it was the Dawson children, but tomorrow it could be any of them who fell afoul of the banker's ambitions. Cole rode out at first light to deliver copies to each of the 5 ranchers personally. He returned after dark, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "Morrison's holding firm, says he'll stand up in court if necessary to defend the contract. Anders Peterson, the one who runs cattle north of here, says the same. The other 3 are wavering, but they haven't pulled out yet." "That's something." Evelyn poured him coffee from the pot that had been warming on the stove. Too committed is better than none. Pettigrew won't stop with the water rights. He's escalating. Cole wrapped his hands around the warm cup. I heard things in town. He's been to see the sheriff, suggesting the children aren't being properly cared for, talking about getting the county involved, maybe placing them with other families. The coffee cup froze halfway to Evelyn's lips. He wouldn't. He absolutely would. It's the perfect strategy. He can't take the land directly anymore, so he removes the children and claims the property is abandoned. Then it reverts to the county for unpaid taxes from previous years, gets auctioned, and he buys it for pennies. Rose had been listening from her bunk, pretending to sleep. Now she sat up, her face pale in the lamplight. They'd separate us, put us in different homes. I'd never see Lila again, or Margaret, or any of them. That's not going to happen. Evelyn's voice was fierce. I won't let it happen. How do you stop it? If the sheriff comes, then we make sure he sees children who are well cared for, healthy, and thriving. We make sure there's not a single legitimate reason to question their welfare. Evelyn crossed to Rose and knelt beside her bunk. You listen to me. You and your siblings are not going to be separated. I promise you that. You can't promise that. You're not... Rose stopped, but the unspoken words hung between them. You're not our mother. You're not even family. Maybe not by blood, Evelyn said quietly, but I'm here and I'm staying and I will fight with everything I have to keep this family together. That's a promise I can make and keep. The next few weeks were a masterclass in survival under scrutiny. Evelyn threw herself into making the homestead as presentable as possible. The children were scrubbed until they gleamed, their clothes mended and clean. The cabin was organized, supplies neatly stored, beds made with military precision. She kept detailed records of meals, showing that the children were well fed. She documented their chores, their schoolwork, every aspect of their daily lives that might be questioned. Cole worked from dawn to dusk making improvements. The barn got a new roof. The fence was completed all the way around the property. He even started breaking ground for a spring garden, working the frozen earth with grim determination. Martha Green and the other women rallied around them, visiting regularly to provide witnesses to the children's well-being. The pastor came once a week to give lessons, ensuring the children's education wasn't neglected. It was a community effort to build an unassailable case that these children were exactly where they belonged. But the strain was taking its toll. Rose had stopped sleeping well. Evelyn could hear her moving around at night, checking on the younger children obsessively. Nate had become hypervigilant, watching the road constantly for signs of the sheriff or anyone else who might pose a threat. Even little Margaret had picked up on the tension, clinging more than usual and having nightmares. The breaking point came on a cold February morning when the sheriff finally arrived. He was a weathered man in his 50s named Tom Crawford, and he looked profoundly uncomfortable with his task. Miss Hartwell, Mr. Dawson, I've had complaints about the welfare of the Dawson children. I'm required to investigate. He removed his hat. I don't like this any more than you do, but it's my job. We understand. Evelyn kept her voice level despite her racing heart. Would you like to inspect the premises? Crawford spent an hour going through the cabin, asking the children questions, examining their living conditions. Evelyn watched his face, trying to read his assessment. He was thorough, but not unkind, speaking gently to the younger children and asking Rose about their daily routine. Finally, he emerged from the cabin and stood in the yard, looking out over the property. The improvements were visible everywhere. The repaired buildings, the tended grounds, the evidence of hard work and care. I'll be honest with you, he said finally. When I got the complaint, I expected to find neglect, maybe worse. But these children are clean, healthy, well-fed, and clearly cared for. The cabin is warm and weatherproof. You've got food stored for winter. The kids can read and cipher. He shook his head. I don't see any grounds for intervention. Evelyn felt her knees weaken with relief. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet. My report will say the children are fine, but that won't stop whoever's behind this from trying again. And we both know who that is. Crawford put his hat back on. Harlan Pettigrew is a persistent man. He'll find another way. Then we'll deal with it. Cole's voice was hard. Same as we've dealt with everything else he's thrown at us. After Crawford left, Evelyn found herself shaking with reaction. She'd been holding herself together for so long, maintaining the facade of confidence and strength, that the release of tension left her feeling hollowed out. Cole found her sitting on the front step, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her without speaking, and they watched the winter sunset paint the prairie in shades of orange and gold. "I'm tired," she said finally. "I'm so tired of fighting." "I know. Every time we solve one problem, he creates another. It never ends, and I don't know how much more the children can take, how much more any of us can take." She turned to look at him. "What if we can't win? What if he just keeps coming until he wears us down and takes everything?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. "You know what John used to say when we were building this cabin? He'd say, 'One board at a time, one nail at a time. You don't build a home by thinking about the whole thing at once. You just do the next thing that needs doing, and eventually you look up and realize you've built something that will stand.' I'm not sure that applies to fighting off a predatory banker. Doesn't it? We keep doing the next thing, keep standing up each time he knocks us down. Keep protecting these kids and this land one day at a time. Eventually, maybe we look up and realize we've built something he can't tear down." Cole's voice roughened. "Or maybe we don't win. Maybe he finds a way to take it all despite everything we do. But at least we fought. At least these kids will know that people cared enough to try." Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. "When did you get so wise?" "About the time I realized that running away from things didn't make them disappear. Took me 8 years and a lot of hard lessons, but I got there eventually." They sat together as the light faded, two people who'd found themselves in an impossible situation and had somehow become each other's anchor. Inside the cabin, Evelyn could hear Rose singing softly to Lila, and the sound of the children's voices raised in some game or argument. It was the sound of family, of home, of something worth fighting for. The final confrontation came in the most public way possible at the Sunday church service 2 weeks later. Evelyn had gotten into the habit of bringing the children to services regularly, partly for their spiritual education, but mostly to keep them visible in the community, a reminder that they were real people, not just an abstraction to be argued over. They were settling into their usual pew when Harlan Pettigrew stood during the announcements portion of the service. His wife beside him looked mortified, as if she knew what was coming and couldn't stop it. "Pastor, if I may address the congregation?" Pettigrew's voice was smooth as oil. The pastor hesitated, clearly sensing trouble, but couldn't refuse without cause. "Of course, Mr. Pettigrew." Pettigrew stood and turned to face the gathered community. "I know there's been some tension regarding the Dawson property. I want to address that directly and honestly before this good Christian community." Evelyn felt Cole tense beside her. She put a hand on his arm, a silent plea for restraint. "I've been painted as a villain in this situation," Pettigrew continued. "A heartless banker preying on orphans. That characterization pains me deeply. The truth is, I've only ever acted within the bounds of the law, enforcing legitimate debts and protecting the bank's interests, which are ultimately the interests of everyone who deposits money there." He paused, looking around the room with practiced sincerity. "But I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm prepared to make a final offer, here and now, that I believe serves everyone's interests. I will purchase the Dawson property for $200, well above its current value given the outstanding debt still attached to it. The children can use that money to start fresh somewhere else, perhaps with relatives or in an orphanage where they'll receive proper care and education." The silence that followed was profound. Evelyn could feel every eye in the church on them, waiting to see how they'd respond. It was Nate who stood first, his young face set with determination that made him look far older than his 11 years. "That land is ours. Our pa died for it. Our ma's buried on it, and pa beside her. You can't put a price on that." "Son, I understand your attachment. I'm not your son." Nate's voice cracked but didn't waver. "And you don't understand anything. You understand money and greed and taking things that don't belong to you, but you don't understand what it means to have a home, to have a place that's yours because your family bled for it." Pettigrew's mask of sympathy slipped. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. These children are being encouraged in unrealistic expectations by adults who should know better. Miss Hartwell, Mr. Dawson, you're doing them no favors by fighting a battle you cannot win." Cole stood now, his full height impressive in the small church. Maybe we can't win, but we can damn sure make sure you don't win easy. Language, please. We're in a house of worship. Pettigrew's voice was sharp. Then let's talk about worship. Let's talk about what John Dawson worshipped. Family, community, the idea that people should help each other instead of exploiting each other's misfortunes. Cole's voice carried to every corner of the church. He gave to this community without asking for anything back. He helped anyone who needed it, never turned anyone away, and when he died, he left behind children who needed help the same way he'd helped others. Cole looked around the room, meeting eyes that couldn't quite meet his. Some of you stepped up. You gave money. You offered support. You remembered what John did for you. And I'm grateful for that. But a lot of you stayed silent, stayed safe, told yourselves it wasn't your problem, or that you couldn't afford to antagonize the bank. This is hardly appropriate, Pettigrew began. I'm not finished. Cole's voice was steel. Here's what I want you all to understand. Today it's us. Tomorrow it could be any of you. A bad harvest, a sick spouse, an unexpected expense, and suddenly you're the one drowning in debt. You're the one looking at losing everything you've built. And when that day comes, you'll find out who your real neighbors are. You'll find out who remembers what community actually means. He turned to face Pettigrew directly. John Dawson knew. He lived it every day. And his children are going to keep living it, on that land, in that home, because that's what he would have wanted. Not your $200, not your pity, just the chance to build something that lasts. Evelyn stood beside Cole, and then Rose stood too, holding Lila. One by one, the other children rose until they were all standing together, a united front against the man who wanted to scatter them. We're not selling, Rose said, her voice clear and strong. Not for $200, not for $2,000. That land is our inheritance, our family's legacy, and we're going to fight for it until there's nothing left to fight with. The church was absolutely silent. Even the pastor seemed at a loss for words. Then Frank Morrison stood. The water cooperative stands with the Dawsons. We signed contracts, and we're honoring them. Anyone who wants to challenge that can take it up with my lawyer. Martha Green stood next. The Women's Auxiliary will continue supporting the children however they need. We don't abandon family, and that's what they've become. One by one, people began standing. Not everyone. There were notable exceptions, people whose financial ties to Pettigrew were too strong to break. But enough. More than half the congregation, rising to their feet in silent solidarity. Pettigrew looked around at the standing figures, and for the first time since Evelyn had met him, he looked genuinely shaken. He'd expected to isolate them, to force them into submission through public pressure. Instead, he'd created exactly the opposite. A public declaration of community support that he couldn't fight without alienating half the town. This isn't over, he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. The law is still the law, and debts are still debts. Then we'll pay them, Evelyn said quietly, one at a time, with the help of people who understand that some things matter more than profit. You wanted a final confrontation, Mr. Pettigrew. You have it, and you've lost. He stared at her, at Cole, at the children standing defiant before him. Then he turned and walked out of the church, his wife hurrying after him. The door slammed behind them with a finality that echoed through the building. The pastor cleared his throat. Well, I think perhaps we should move to prayer. But before he could begin, little Margaret tugged on Evelyn's skirt. Miss Evelyn, does this mean we get to stay? Does this mean we won? Evelyn knelt down so she was eye level with the girl. Yes, sweetheart, I think it does. The weeks that followed felt like emerging from a long winter into unexpected spring. Pettigrew made no further moves against them, his influence in the community damaged by his public defeat. The water cooperative contracts held firm, providing steady income. The remaining debts were negotiated down and put on payment plans that the homestead could actually afford. Cole proved that his promise to stay was genuine. He filed papers with the county to become the children's legal guardian, a process that required testimony from neighbors about his character and commitment. The hearing was brief. The judge took one look at the improved homestead, the healthy children, and the stack of affidavits from community members, and granted the petition without hesitation. But the most significant change was the one that grew slowly between Evelyn and Cole. They'd been partners in crisis, united by necessity and shared purpose. As the immediate threats receded, they found themselves learning each other in quieter ways. The way he always made sure she had coffee in the morning before he started his work. The way she mended his clothes without being asked, her skilled fingers repairing tears and worn spots. The way they fell into conversation in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing while the children slept. Spring came early that year, melting the last of the winter snow and bringing the prairie back to life. Cole and Nate broke ground for planting, working side by side with an ease that spoke of growing trust. Rose had started smiling more, the weight of responsibility finally shared enough that she could remember what it felt like to be a child. The younger ones were simply thriving, Lila growing plump and healthy, Margaret's nightmares fading, Thomas and Samuel roughhousing with the kind of energy only truly secure children could muster. One evening in late April, Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Cole came to stand beside her, wiping dirt from his hands. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is." But he was looking at her instead of the sunset. "Evelyn, I need to talk to you about something." Her heart stuttered, uncertain what was coming. "When you came here, you were planning to marry my brother, build a life with him." Cole's voice was rough. "That didn't happen, and you ended up fighting battles that weren't yours, caring for children you had no obligation to, nearly bankrupting yourself to save a family you'd never met." "I don't regret any of it." "I know you don't. That's part of what I'm trying to say." He turned to face her fully. "You could leave tomorrow. Go back east, start the life you were supposed to have. But I'm hoping you won't. I'm hoping you'll stay. Not as the woman who came too late, but as someone who chose to be here. Someone who belongs." Evelyn's breath caught. "Cole, what are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd consider making this permanent. Not out of obligation or necessity, but because, He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because somewhere in all this fighting and struggling, I fell in love with you. With your strength and your stubbornness and the way you never give up on anything worth fighting for. And I know I'm not the man you planned to marry. I'm rough around the edges, I've got a past full of mistakes, and I can't offer you anything fancy or easy. But I can offer you a home, a family, and a man who'll stand beside you through whatever comes next." Evelyn felt tears prickling at her eyes. "You're right. You're not the man I planned to marry, but you're the man I want to marry. The one who came when I called, who fought for his family, who proved that sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never saw coming." Cole's face broke into a smile that transformed his weathered features. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." She laughed through her tears. "I'll marry you, Cole Dawson. Not because I need rescuing or because these children need a mother, but because I choose you. I choose all of this." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Evelyn felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't even realized was unsettled. This was home. Not the place or the land, but the people, the family she'd found in the most unexpected way possible. Behind them, the cabin door creaked open. "Are you kissing?" Margaret's voice was delighted. "Does this mean Miss Evelyn is staying forever?" Cole pulled back, his arm still around Evelyn's waist. "If she'll have us, yes." The children poured out of the cabin in a rush of noise and excitement. Rose's smile was the widest Evelyn had ever seen. Nate actually whooped with joy. The little ones danced around them, asking a dozen questions at once. "Can we have a wedding?" Margaret demanded. "Will you wear a pretty dress?" Samuel wanted to know. "Does this mean Uncle Cole gets to sleep inside instead of the barn?" Thomas asked, practical as always. Evelyn laughed, overwhelmed by their enthusiasm. "Yes to all of it. Yes to the wedding, yes to the dress, and yes, your uncle gets to come in from the barn." "Finally," Rose said with feeling. "It's been ridiculous, making him sleep out there when there's room inside." "There wasn't room before," Cole protested. "There is now. We'll figure it out. We always do." Rose took Lila from Evelyn's arms and settled the baby on her hip. "When's the wedding going to be?" Evelyn looked at Cole, seeing her own joy reflected in his eyes. "Soon," she said, "as soon as we can arrange it." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the same small church where they'd faced down Harlan Pettigrew. The entire community turned out, packing the pews and spilling out into the churchyard. Martha Green had helped Evelyn make a dress from new fabric purchased with the first profits from the water cooperative. Simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, elegant in its simplicity. Rose and Margaret wore new dresses too, their faces scrubbed and shining. Nate stood up as Cole's best man, proud in his father's altered suit. The younger boys fidgeted in their seats but managed to stay mostly quiet during the ceremony. The pastor spoke about family and commitment, about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, about building something that would last. Evelyn barely heard the words, too focused on Cole's calloused hands holding hers, on the promise in his eyes that echoed the one she was making. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, not as strangers brought together by necessity, but as partners who'd chosen each other through everything life had thrown at them. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Frank Morrison had donated a side of beef. The women of the church had baked enough food to feed everyone twice over. There was music and dancing, children running wild in the churchyard, adults laughing and talking and celebrating a wedding that felt like more than just two people joining their lives. It felt like a community healing, like a declaration that kindness and mutual support could prevail over greed and isolation. Like proof that John Dawson's legacy of generosity was bearing fruit even after his death. As evening fell and people began drifting home, Evelyn stood with Cole watching the children play. They were dirty and exhausted and deliriously happy, their laughter carrying across the prairie like music. "Thank you," Cole said quietly. "For what?" "For writing that letter. For coming here when you could have left. For fighting when anyone else would have given up." He pulled her close. "For giving me a second chance to be part of something that matters. Thank you for being the kind of man who answered the letter, who came when he was needed, who stayed when staying was hard." Evelyn leaned into his embrace. "We make a good team." "The best." He kissed the top of her head. "You ready to go home?" Home. The word resonated in Evelyn's chest like a bell. The homestead wasn't just a place anymore. It was family, community, belonging. It was everything she'd been searching for when she'd answered John Dawson's advertisement, found in ways she never could have imagined. They gathered the children and headed back to the wagon. As they drove through the gathering dusk, Evelyn looked back at the church one last time. She'd arrived in Kansas 5 months ago as a desperate woman with nowhere else to go, expecting to marry a stranger and settle for a tolerable life. Instead, she'd found a family worth fighting for, a community worth believing in, a man worth loving, and a home that was truly hers, not because it had been given to her, but because she'd earned it through blood, sweat, tears, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. The homestead came into view as the last light faded from the sky, and Evelyn felt her throat tighten with emotion. The cabin stood sturdy and weatherproof, smoke curling from the chimney. The barn and outbuildings were solid, testament to hours of hard work. The fence posts stood straight, marking boundaries that were theirs to keep. It wasn't fancy, it would never be easy. But it was home, and it was theirs, and that was more than enough. Cole helped her down from the wagon, and together they watched as the children raced inside, already arguing about who got which bed now that the sleeping arrangements were changing. Their voices drifted out through the open door, full of life and joy and the casual confidence of children who knew they were safe. "You know what the best part is?" Evelyn asked. "What's that?" "In every version of this story I imagined, I was the one being rescued, the mail-order bride finding salvation through marriage." She smiled up at him. "But that's not what happened at all. We rescued each other, all of us." Cole wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together in the gathering dark, listening to the sounds of their children settling in for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be challenges. But they'd face them together as a family, with the kind of strength that came from choosing each other every single day. Evelyn Hartwell had come to Kansas to marry a man she'd never met. Instead, she'd found 6 children who needed a mother, a community that needed reminding of its better nature, and a man who'd spent years running from home before finally learning what it meant to stay. She'd come too late to meet her intended husband, but she'd arrived exactly when she was needed to become part of something far more important than she'd ever dared to dream. Not a wife found through desperate advertisement, but a mother, a partner, a fighter, and the woman who'd refused to let a family fall apart when everyone else said it was impossible. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of spring planting and summer harvest, of challenges overcome and futures built one day at a time. Inside the cabin, someone lit a lamp, and warm light spilled out into the darkness, like welcome. Evelyn took Cole's hand and led him inside, toward the family and the life they'd fought so hard to claim. The door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the cold and the darkness and the battles they'd already won. Tomorrow would come with its own trials. But tonight, in this moment, they had everything that mattered: each other, their children, and a home that had been earned through love, sacrifice, and the stubborn belief that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.